They laughed at me that night, called me a fat pig. I watched them smile, then watched the police take the glittering ring off the woman who'd been stealing from me. You won't believe how I set it up. If you've ever been stabbed in the back by someone you loved, hit like, subscribe, and tell me your story below. This one will make your blood sing. For 10 years, I lived quietly in the house my husband and I built while a secret safe held what others dismissed as ugly antiques worth over $15 million. When a 5-carat pink diamond vanished at a gala, every quiet deceit tumbled into the light. And what I did next changed everything. The house remembers more than I do sometimes. It keeps its stories in the grain of the floorboards, in the soft dent of the armchair where Arthur used to fall asleep, with the paper on his chest, in the faint circle where his teacup always sat. When I open the sideboard drawer each morning, I still find his handkerchief folded exactly how he liked it, the faint scent of his aftershave like a ghost that knows my name. I can trace a life in these small things. The lemon polish I learned to use on the dining table the summer we celebrated our 50th, the worn brass of the front door, the row of coat hooks by the hall where Arthur's hat used to hang. I built this house with him. We painted every room together, argued about the curtains, and then compromised. Held hands in the kitchen while the rain made soft music against the windows. It is not a museum. It is the home we made. They say grief dulls over time, but memory sharpens in odd ways. I remember the exact tilt of Arthur's head the day he decided on the little safe he wanted in the study. Small, Victorian, with a hidden compartment he liked to joke about. He called it his little insurance against the world. Arthur liked the notion of keeping certain things private. He called discretion a kind of kindness. He collected things the way some people collect stamps, not for show, but because each piece had a reason, a story threaded through it like a ribbon. Inventory hash 847, that ridiculous, glorious pink diamond ring. To anyone else might have looked like clutter. To me, it was a punctuation mark in Arthur's life, a laugh in metal and stone. Serena arrived like a winter wind that smelled of perfume and new money. She wore her hair slick, and her shoes made faint clicking sounds down the hallway that always put me on edge. There was a posture about her, a careful angle of the chin, a smile that had been practiced in front of glass and polished to a sheen, and she moved through the rooms as if she were touring a house she already owned. At first I thought I was being sensitive. I wanted to be civil. Oliver had married the woman he loved. I laid out tea, folded napkins, and tried to remember not to compare anyone to Arthur, but Serena had a way of making the whole room tilt toward her and away from everything else, including me. Oliver is a good man most of the time, the sort who apologizes for being distracted because someone else needed him. He has this habit of absently fixing his cufflinks when things get awkward, and for years I forgave him small absences because he always came around at the end of the day. He loved his father, and he loves me in the way sons do, protective but sometimes blind. Walter, Arthur's old friend, and the lawyer with a laugh like a gravel path, used to drop by with newspapers folded under his arm and stories he told that always ended with a conspiratorial wink. He kept his loyalty soft and steady, like the tick of a grandfather clock. There were others, acquaintances and neighbors, but these were the people who occupied the closest circles of my days. Serena's laugh was silk and glass. It glinted in the corners and left shards. Once, at the end of an afternoon where I'd cleared crumbs from the dining table and set out the silver, she reached into my dressing room and pulled out a battered brooch Arthur had given me on our 30th anniversary. She held it up between 2 fingers, turned it like it was a curiosity at a boutique, and said, "It's just old junk, Mum." The words were soft. So many might have missed them, but they lodged like a needle. It wasn't the dismissal of the object that hurt. It was the dismissal of the life behind it. I smiled because I had been practiced at smiling for years and said nothing. But later, alone in my room, I pressed the brooch to my palm and felt the warmth Arthur had left in its metal. There was a rhythm to the small cruelties at first. Omissions in conversation, invitations that never arrived. The way dinner plans shifted so that I was no longer asked to join. They were gentle, like a slow tide taking away sand one grain at a time. Serena would rearrange the hall table and place glossy magazines where Arthur's gardening notebooks had been. She'd call me darling in a tone that had a hint of pity, and sometimes she'd leave lists of chores on the counter as though I had become something to be managed. The kitchen, once the heart of the house where laughter and soups and small reconciliations happened, became my station, the room I retreated to while they entertained. At night, when the house settled and the shadows came with their soft sounds, I found myself replaying little moments the way one might reread a letter. I started to notice patterns, a missing tea saucer here, a photograph displaced there. I would tell myself it was absent-mindedness. Oliver joked sometimes about age and forgetfulness, and I would laugh with him, but the laughter tasted like tin. My internal world grew more compact. I folded my indignations into small, quiet pockets to carry through the day. I wrote lists to make sense of memory. I polished things not because they would be admired, but because doing so let me speak to a continuity. This table has been here since 1978. This lamp was a wedding present. A tiny unease began as a whisper. I noticed the way Serena would open drawers with quick, practiced motions and the way she looked at certain cabinets as if calculating. Once, at a charity gala where their laughter floated up like music through champagne glasses, she reached into my room to fuss with a dress and texted later, "The attic is full of the oddest things, Mum. You should clear it out." The text was casual, as if the house itself were clutter to be tidied. That night, my sleep was thin. There were moments of sweetness still. Walter would bring over lemon biscuits and sit in the study, tucking the loose tail of his newspaper under his hand as if sealing a page of ordinary days. Oliver would come by, apologetic, bringing stories from his work and a smile he thought would smooth things over. They were real. The comfort in the small commonplaces. And I clung to them because they kept the possibility of ordinary love alive. But Serena's presence curled at the edges of everything like a dampness that crept into the hems of curtains. 2 years, maybe a little less, is the span I have to measure the small thefts. They were never the kind that anyone would notice until you noticed them all at once. A pair of cufflinks gone from Arthur's box. A brooch missing its pin. A bracelet misplaced and later described as probably in a drawer somewhere. Once, I found a pawn ticket folded inside a book I'd been meaning to catalog. It was small, the kind of thing an honest person might have misplaced. It was also dated and bore a tiny scribble of a name, familiar enough to make my throat close. When I asked Serena about it, she blinked, smiled, and said, "You're so silly sometimes, Mum. Things wander. I'll help you look." The way she said help felt like a glove turned inside out. The gaslighting was a slow, careful flame. "Are you sure you put that there?" she would ask, waving a hand over a shelf as if the location of a teapot was an argument worth winning. Oliver, distracted by his own life and charmed by his wife, would sometimes take the easy route of believing the more dramatic account because denial is less painful than confrontation. He would say, "Maybe you left it at the club, Mum," and I would let the suggestion sit because proving myself right had become heavy work, and I was tired. One afternoon, a small sound under Serena's bag snagged my attention. The faint rustle of a receipt paper, the click of a clasp, and my curiosity led me to the study where she claimed she'd left her things. There, half tucked under the arm of her coat, I noticed the corner of a slip I had seen before. A pawn shop receipt with a handwriting I recognized from the ledger Arthur used to keep for me when his hands were steadier. I remember the heat that rose then, not feverish but precise like the tightening of a well-drawn bow. I folded the receipt into my palm and felt the paper's rough grain against my fingers, as if it were a small, accusing talisman. I started to catalog again. There is a pleasure and a necessity in naming things. I sat at the table with a notebook and pencil, the same way Arthur would, and wrote each item's description as if the act of writing pinned them safely into the world. Inventory hash 847, pink diamond ring, 5 carats, Arthur's gift stored in the little safe in the study. I wrote it down as one might preserve a memory against erosion. It felt like lighting a candle against a draft. The safe's key was on its little hook in the study, a brass thing that fit snug in my palm. I walked to the study with the catalog in my bag, the lemon-scented polish still smelling in the air from when I'd cleaned that morning, and took the key down. It was colder than I expected, the metal cool against my skin in a way that made my breath catch. I turned it over in my fingers, thinking of the many times Arthur had turned it with a small, conspiratorial smile, and something tight and steady clicked into place inside me. The safe smelled of leather and lemon polish, a quiet, domestic scent that somehow felt like a promise. When I eased the brass dial, it clicked into place with a small, obedient sound, metal answering metal, and the lid sighed open like a secret finally exhaling. Inside, each item had its own small, muffled world. Velvet folds, the soft scuff of silk, the way light settled on a stone and refused to let go. Inventory hash 847 lay in its velvet bed, the pink diamond catching the room's dimness and making it blush. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It simply existed, patient and precise, and I had given it a name because names keep things safe from being swallowed. Arthur taught me the catalog. He used to sit at that little oak table, the same one with the nick on the corner where the children had carved their initials, and he would trace each item with a reverent finger. "Write it down," he'd say, "or it won't be real." So I did. Page after page, I wrote the maker, the weight, the faint chip on the clasp where the light hit it best. The ledger was a warm thing in my hands, inked evidence of a lifetime. It smelled faintly of him, tobacco and shaving soap, a ghost that comforted me on bad nights. I kept the safe hidden behind a frame in the study. The frame was crooked on purpose, an old joke between Arthur and me. The everyday world passed without noticing that nook of careful law and soft metal. To everyone else, it was an attic of oddities. To me, it was the proof that what Arthur and I had built together had weight, had value beyond the little domestic cruelties that crept in around the edges. Serena arrived the way winter arrives, first by degrees, then suddenly. At first, she was all silk and practiced laughter, the kind of woman who sold warmth like a product and wrapped it in expensive perfume. She took the house's light for granted the way some people take a city bus for granted, a simple, useful thing. She called the lace fussy and the curtains old-fashioned. She rearranged vases like someone resetting a scene in a play she expected to star in. Her first words to me, said with a careless downward glance, were a small stone. "It's just old junk, Mom." Those words lodged. They buzzed underneath my skin like a wasp you can't quite catch. A brooch here, a watch there, tiny vanishings at first, the sort of thing you notice in the margin of an afternoon and then misplace because you're tired. I would open the ledger and cross-check. The brooch was missing from row 5. The watch didn't bear the same patina. A receipt for a pawn shop, folded small and secretive, slipped out of a jacket that had been left draped over a chair. I saw it for a single heartbeat, the way men glance at a headline on the subway and pretend it isn't about them. When I confronted her, my voice was paper thin. I remember the way my hand hovered over the ledger, as if the pages could anchor me. "That brooch," I said, and my voice did that trembly thing it gets when I'm afraid no one will hear me. Her smile didn't change. She set her teacup down with careful fingers and leaned back, like a cat that has all the time in the world. "It's just old junk, Mum," she repeated, that phrase polished and dangerous now, as if I were a coin with no engraving. "You keep everything. You're sentimental." It was meant to dismiss. It did more than that. It dismissed a marriage, a life, the small, painstaking decisions Arthur and I had made over decades. Oliver looked at me and then away. His eyes had always surprised me that way, a kindness tempered by distraction. I saw him shrink when he realized the room had split into 2 colonies. He wanted to fix it, but he had been taught that a happier face was easier to love than the truth. I felt a change then, so faint at first that I almost missed it. Hurt moved into something colder. It wasn't fury so much as arithmetic. 1 missing item, 2 a pattern. The ledger began to look less like pages and more like a map. Where the map led, I didn't yet know, but I knew the terrain. I had made it. I knew the cracks that a quick handshake and a bright smile could hide. Walter answered on the second ring. He'd been Arthur's solicitor before he was mine, a man with a voice like gravel softened by long familiarity. "Are you all right?" he asked. He always began like that. He knew how to let a small crisis settle into a chair before he asked for the facts. I told him what I knew. I left out nothing and left nothing for him to guesses. His silence was the kind that holds a plan. I hired Robert, a private investigator who smelled like strong coffee and honesty. Robert had the kind of blunt, practical manner that makes lies uncomfortable. They don't like to sit on him. He came twice, then thrice, and each visit left a footprint in the house, a notepad, a camera that blinked like a cocky eye, questions that momentarily stunned Serena into small, polite falsehoods. I sat with the coffee turning cold at my elbows, watching how the house behaved under inspection. Bedrooms held their breath, curtains softened the light, the ledger lay open on the table like a patient animal. I remember the sensation, palms sweating, the sting of the betrayal like salt on a paper cut. It wasn't just the missing things, it was the minutes of my life that she had accepted as hers to take. It was the whispered conversations behind doors, the casual suggestions about nursing homes, as though a lifetime could be folded away like a handkerchief. It was Oliver's easy concessions, his habit of smoothing things over with a joke. The ledger had become more than a list. It was proof that someone had been erasing me in small, careful strokes. We began to set traps as quiet as breath. Robert lined up times when Serena would be away and sent off discreet queries to pawnshops. Small images came back. A brooch under a different name, a watch under different hands. They were like photographs taken through a keyhole. Evidence arrived in slow, cruel installments. Each one tightened the noose of certainty. The plan didn't come as a dramatic bolt. It formed the way frost forms, a pattern of tiny ice crystals that will one day make glass brittle. Walter suggested legal channels. "We don't act until we have iron," he said, the sort of phrase you remember because it echoes with practical righteousness. So we gathered iron. We recorded dates. We compiled receipts. We let the calendar do some of the work. There was an odd sense of relief in meticulousness, an antidote to the hollow outrage that sometimes makes you shout at the wrong people. Serena's gala arrived like the last bright chapter of a tabloid novel. The invitation was printed on thick card and folded with hands that thought ceremony could absolve anything. She asked if I would sit with her family, parade me like an accessory at the table of her life. I saw the gala as the perfect stage. Too many people, too much pretense. If there was ever a place where a pair of hands could be seen in action, it was there. Flashing under the ballroom lights, traded in the private darkness of cloakrooms and pockets. I made the decision to wait. Waiting was an active thing, not passive. It required a sort of professional patience, like a fisherman knowing when to set the net and when to let the water be. I could have shouted, called the police the moment the brooch disappeared, but a man who cries wolf loses his voice for when the real wolf comes. So I waited. I watched. I catalogued. I watched Serena make the world into a stage for her charm. I watched Oliver smile in a way that no longer reached his eyes. I watched the ledger like a hawk. In the days leading up to the gala, I walked the house with the ledger tucked under my arm. I checked the safe with the kind of ritual that was half prayer, half counting beads. Velvet, metal. The dull thud of the safe's door closing. The key in the small pocket on my dressing table felt cold against my palm. Metal that remembered Arthur's fingers, too. I would sit for a long time on the sofa and listen to the house breathe. There was the faint sound of a clock somewhere, the distant clink of china as Serena rehearsed the gestures she would use under chandeliers. When I imagined the night, it wasn't about spectacle. It was about precision. It was about the clarity that comes when the world finally names itself. I wanted not fury, but revelation, an unveiling of the small arithmetic of theft and scorn. I wanted the ledger to speak, to show that what had been dismissed as old junk had history and weight and right. I wanted Oliver to see the ledger and to see the ledger as a mirror. So, I waited. I let the plan take its slow legal shape. I let Walter and Robert do the noisy things while I kept the ledger close. The house became an accomplice in the quiet way that built things do. It held its rooms, it kept its corners dark, it sheltered the details until they all lined up like pins. On the last night before the gala, Serena rehearsed in front of the full-length mirror. Her gown fell and refolded itself like a threat. She smoothed the fabric, smiled, and practiced the charm I knew would disarm many in the glittering room. I watched her from the doorway, the ledger heavy in my hands and the key a small cold thing in my pocket, imagining the way the light would find the pink diamond and make it impossible to deny. Robert's first report arrived at midnight, the subject line, photos plus timestamps. I opened it with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and felt the slow, familiar deepening of anger, sharp and cold like a cut lemon. The photos were small squares on my screen, Serena's profile as she walked into a pawn shop, the back of her head as she handed over a velvet box, the shopkeeper's scuffed counter. Each image carried its own quiet proof. The timestamps were exact. The metadata was a map. I remember the sound of the kettle clicking off that night, the ordinary domestic noise anchoring the absurdity. I sat at the table and read every line twice. Robert's notes were surgical, economical, what I wanted, facts, not melodrama. He'd carved out a trail, receipts, photos, a voice recording where a man at the counter named names and described pieces. He had traced transactions to a small chain of pawnbrokers that serviced the glittering suburbs Serena liked to play in. There was nothing sentimental in those pages, only evidence that pulled at the edges of my life and revealed how much had been removed without my permission. Walter phoned me at 2 a.m. His voice was steady, older, something I had always trusted like a good chair. "Hold fire, we need the whole picture," he said. 2 words that felt like a command and a salve. Hold fire, wait, gather. He reminded me, politely, firmly, that a hurried accusation would be a loose thread the opposition could pull at. We wanted incontrovertible proof, not a story built on suspicion. I listened, breathed, repeated his words in my head until the sharp edges softened. Robert's follow-ups read like a detective novel I never wanted to be part of. He had trailed Serena after lunch and recorded serial pawning of small brooches and watches, objects that once lived in my drawers under tissue paper. The reports contained snapshots of conversations, receipts with handwriting I recognized because it was the same kind of hurried scribble that had signed credit card slips I'd found in charity shops once. Every small loss had a corresponding pawn ticket. Each ticket had a serial number. Each serial number led to a deposit. Each deposit began to sketch a ledger of her life, her spending, her appointments, the dates. She dressed up for galas. Reading those reports late into the night, I tasted iron on my tongue, not from blood, but from the metallic tang of rage. It was a physical reaction that made me aware of my bones, the steady pulse thudding behind my ears. I read and read until the words blurred and then returned to them like a woman checking a child's fever. Evidence is a slow thing. It builds, layer by layer. It is methodical. I had not imagined it could be so satisfying to see a sequence of small betrayals lined up and labeled, each with a date, each with proof. There were quieter moments in Robert's files that gutted me. A photo of Serena laughing, a glass raised, while a brooch, one that had been Arthur's mother's, sat in a little brown envelope behind the counter. A text message from Serena to a friend asking whether pawnbrokers pay more near the city. A voicemail where the pawnbroker said plainly, "We don't ask questions when someone brings us decent stock." The casualness of it, the way she treated my things as disposable, the way my life became background noise to her appetite. When the evidentiary pattern revealed itself, a trail of small items escalating, Walter's voice in my ear grew firmer. He sketched out legal pathways while Robert continued to shadow and photograph. I felt absurdly proud of the neatness of it all. I felt absurdly small for having allowed weeks and then years of small cruelties to be mistaken in my head for ordinary family friction. I learned a different vocabulary: chain of custody, provenance, asset tracing. I learned to sit with a file and let each piece of paper make me smarter, not angrier, though the anger came quietly, like a tide. Memories of Arthur slipped into the margins of that work like warm paper tucked between official pages. His lessons did not arrive as lectures, but as tiny, stubborn examples. He would polish the silver not to show off, but because the act of careful attention was how he spoke to the people he loved. Once, when I'd fretted about a rash of mislaid keys, he said, "Patience, love. You'll find what you're looking for when you stop blaming the world and start accounting for your things." At the time, I'd laughed it off. Now, pinned under a pile of photocopies, his voice became an instruction manual on restraint and timing. Those memories softened me and sharpened me at the same time. When Robert's photo feeds began to sing a clearer song, receipts matching the descriptions of items from my inventory, photos of the same brooch at different pawn counters, a different kind of grief rose up. Not the hollow, aimless grief of loss, but the incandescent recognition of betrayal. I remembered Arthur's hands on my shoulder, the weight of his presence, and I felt the ache of what had been taken in another register. The theft wasn't just of objects, it was of dignity, of the quiet ownership of a lifetime. We built the case like one would build a small fort. Robert's images were the bricks, Walter's legal counsel the mortar. I cataloged every note Robert sent, placed them in folders with dates, indexes, and cross-references, my handwriting becoming another layer of evidence. Each night, I would sit with a lamp and fine-tune the inventory, checking margins, writing marginalia, noting inconsistencies in pawnbroker testimonies. There was a ritual to it now, a cadence. The catalog became my armor. Late one afternoon, when the light through the conservatory was a sharp, brittle thing, Robert slipped a USB drive across the table to me. "You'll want to see this," he said. He didn't need to elaborate. The drive contained videos, grainy phone footage of Serena handling one of the pieces, settling a piece into her purse with the same careless motion she used to tuck her napkin under her chin at dinner. In the corner of a frame, a stamp of a gala invite, prepped and labeled, suggested the perfect opportunity. A room full of people whose gossip was worth as much as their jewels. I slept little. Sleep felt like surrender. Instead, I rehearsed small phrases, imagined the look on Serena's face if the story of her life was shown in the clean light of proof. I practiced the patience Arthur would have approved of. I thought of timing as a thing you measure in breaths and calendar days. Then, one evening, Robert handed me something that changed the shape of the game. A chain of messages between Serena and an appraiser. They were candid, transactional, photos attached, questions about color grades and clarity, remarks about how certain pieces might be described as ugly to the untrained eye to lower suspicion. The messages mentioned one ring in particular, referred to by an inventory number that made my breath catch, 847. I knew that number like a prayer. I had recorded it in neat script years ago on the inside cover of my inventory book, an annotation beside a sketch, a thumbprint of memory. Inventory hash 847. The pink diamond Arthur had once joked looked like something a queen's daughter would wear to tea. Reading those texts felt like watching an old film strip of a plan being developed. They were clinical. They mentioned potential routes to sell, to launder, to hide. Worse, one line hinted at something more sinister. Talk of having me assessed, of legal counsel that could be purchased to secure guardianship. The idea of being declared incompetent to manage my own affairs was an indignity I had carried in the back of my mind like a splinter. Now the splinter had been revealed as a sharpened tool. My hands remembered how to be steady. I called Walter. We spoke in short sentences. We parsed the texts, annotated them, compared dates. "We don't move yet," he said, the same advice, now a liturgy. "We assemble, we corroborate, we execute when the net is complete." There was a plan forming that smelled of courtroom air and the antiseptic calm of lawyers' offices, a plan that married justice to patience. I liked the marriage. The more evidence Robert produced, the bolder the pattern became. Photographs of Serena entering pawnbrokers with satchels, receipts for cash withdrawn shortly after items were sold, a list of contacts who had been suspiciously helpful. and threaded through the margins a more damning pattern, messages where Serena spoke about me as if I were already not herself, notes on potential psychologists and firms who could attest to cognitive decline. That final detail cut deeper than the loss of a ring. It revealed ambition shaped like cruelty. I remember sitting under the lamp one night, the house breathing around me. The sugar jar sat untouched. The kettle had gone cold. I thumbed through an old envelope Arthur had tucked away years earlier. A neat, handwritten will, a line about loving me in every small, stubborn way. His script had curved in that way I had always loved. I touched the paper like a talisman, and then, with a steadiness that surprised me, returned to the files. The plan would be surgical, it would be visible, it would be clean. When the time came to choose the occasion, the social calendar chose for me. Serena had received an invitation to a charity gala, a room full of her friends, the glittering crowd she loved, the very milieu where she had sought applause. It was a stage. We decided to let the stage do the work it promised. Walter drew up papers to ensure the chain of custody for any recovered items. Robert refined his angles and positions for photography. I rehearsed a simple, unremarkable phrase, the kind of phrase you would send without thinking, a phrase that carried the weight of a woman who had decided to move at last. I typed it with the calm of someone closing a drawer for the final time. Have fun, dear. I didn't send it immediately. I sat with the words, tasting them like a small wine. I smelled the lemon polish that was always in the air when I opened the long oak drawers where the inventory lay. I imagined Serena preening under the chandeliers, the ring warm and bright at her finger. I pictured the audible intake of breath when someone realized the glitter on display was not theirs to flaunt. Then I hit send and dialed Walter. Now, I said. My voice sounded larger in my ears than I felt. He gave a single click, the signal that his men were in position, that protocols were in place, that officers had been briefed. Robert's messages pinged across the line with last-minute adjustments. There was the faint sound of heels in my memory, Serena's heels tapping an impatient rhythm I had heard for years. As I eased the safe open that night, the metal hinge inhaled with a sound I have always cherished, the concentrated little breath that means something of worth is near. The velvet felt cool under my palms. Inventory hash 847 lay where I had last seen it, wrapped in tissue that smelled faintly of Arthur's aftershave, a scent that took me by the throat and steadied my hands. I extracted a single file from the drawer and closed the safe with the same precise care Arthur had taught me. The file contained photocopies, annotations, a neat index. It was everything assembled into a quiet, devastating knot. I put the file into my bag. I raised the lamp higher. Light pooled over the pages. For the first time in a long while, I felt not like a woman being moved around by other people's plans, but like the architect of an ending I had long rehearsed. The trap was not a snap. It was a net, woven by patient hands, and we would let no holes remain. Outside, the night lay still as a held breath. Inside, my pulse thrummed a measured tempo. The pieces were in place. The next act would be public, and that gave it teeth. I sat back and, with the absurd pleasure of someone who has lived through too much quiet, allowed myself a small, private smile. The ballroom breathed like a living thing. Low, warm, pressing, crystal chandeliers spilled pale moons across lacquered tables. The scent of expensive perfume braided with citrus canapes and the faint, metallic tang that comes when a room is full of people pretending not to listen. Laughter bubbled high and brittle. Music lounged in the background, a slow thing in a string of silk and small talk. My heart found a steady rhythm against my ribs, and I matched it like a metronome, careful, patient. I had learned to measure time in other people's complacency. Serena moved through the room like she owned the layout of other people's lives, a borrowed smile, fingers that smoothed fabric as if smoothing away flaws in the world. Her gown was the kind of green that made rich men forget to breathe. It folded and unfurled around her like a blade with satin edges. People leaned into her, eager to be reflected by someone they deemed glamorous. Oliver stood close by, the way he always did, as if proximity could make up for the years he let things slide. He laughed at jokes he didn't hear and tucked a hand into his jacket as though to keep himself presentable for the night's photographs. I did not look like I belonged. My dress was simple, my hair pinned back with the same comb Arthur used to joke about, and my hands smelled faintly of lemon polish, a scent that had been my home for 50 years. But I had a ticket, and Walter had insisted on my being there. He had said, plainly, that I deserved to be seen when the curtain dropped. I kept my face neutral as a photograph. I let the world catalog me one way in their heads, until the moment it had to be corrected. Lights softened. Someone toasted something about philanthropy and good causes. A waiter passed with a tray of flutes. The crystals chimed like tiny bells. I watched Serena from across the room, the way you watch a patient insect before you put a jar over it. She chatted, flirted, slipped a palm to adjust a neckline, and then, with the casual entitlement of a woman who thinks rules bend for her, reached for my ring. The motion was small, a hand extended, the briefest dip at a cuff, fingers finding the ring on her way by. There was a little smile, the kind that says, "I'll take what I want, and you'll forget I was ever there." Robert was beside me, without fanfare. He had the look of a man who spends nights collecting other people's truths, a camera slung under his jacket like an extra heart. He tapped my knee. His eyes were an island of calm. He met mine and, with a fraction of a movement, signaled the single word we had agreed on. Now. Time folded. The world quietly slowed to the width of Serena's hand. I described it later as in slow motion because that is how memory keeps its knives sharp. The glitter of a napkin in the pallid light, the tiny sound of metal kissing metal when the ring slipped out of its place, the hitch in a laugh that was meant to be easy. I saw the way the diamond caught the chandelier and broke it into a million impatient suns. For a moment, Serena's laugh smeared across her face and became something else. A gasp, a thin gasp that trembled like a china cup before it shatters. Robert moved with the precise certainty of a man who had rehearsed the angles. He stepped forward, camera raised, and a few feet away, Walter cleared his throat loud enough to shear the music. An officer of the law, how strange that phrase felt and how sweet it tasted, rose from a table as if from a tide, his uniform catching the light like a promise. He approached them as though he carried the weight of a beginning. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, and his voice cut through the hotel's warm hum. Serena's hand recoiled as if she'd been burned. She tucked the clutch closer to her body, a practiced motion to hide something that should have been invisible. Faces around the room fell into a new shape. Curiosity first, then fascination, then the slow souring of amusement into that rarer thing. Scandal. Oliver's color drained. He blinked 3 times, like someone being dragged awake. He looked at his wife, at the officer, then at me, and in that instant, the scaffolding of his complacency cracked. "There's been a misunderstanding," Serena fluttered, her voice tight and high-pitched, the way a marionette might sound when its strings are cut. Her teeth showed too much. It's mine, a family heirloom." The words were a thin paper wall against the accumulated evidence that had gathered like storm clouds outside the gala doors. "Step aside, ma'am," the officer said. He was no one's villain. He simply had a list of facts and the patience to apply them. Another officer, moved with a purpose I'd felt only once before, the day Arthur had taught me how to read a ledger. They escorted her, not violently, but with the procedural cool of professionals who have seen too many people believe their charm will keep them floating above consequence. The gasp peeled through the room like an animal. Phones were suddenly in hands, lenses pointed. I watched the scene from a distance that felt like vantage rather than exile. Serena's face changed, as it always does when the mask slips. Defeat, then anger, then the quick, animal calculation of a trapped thing. Her eyes found Oliver, and the betrayal that had been a slow rot for a decade flashed between them like broken glass. He reached for her, then caught himself as though the laws of gravity had corrected. He had to choose in that split second between love and seeing, and he chose seeing. The choice made him a different man in the eyes of everyone who had watched him look away for so long. When they led her from the ballroom, the orchestra kept playing for the space of a breath. and in that breath the room decided whether to be cruel or humane. Most of them clung to the spectacle, some looked away. A woman near the band whispered things and fanned herself. Rich people rebalanced their glances to avoid the stain of scandal on their evening. My face stung, not from tears, but from the long, slow uncoiling of something that had tightened in my chest for years. We did not linger. Walter had been at my elbow with papers in a folder like an offering. He took my hand briefly, and it was as though he anchored me. "We move now," he said quietly. "We do not let this disintegrate into gossip." His voice carried neither triumph nor malice, only the thin thread of righteousness that justice sometimes needs to strain itself upon. At the station, fluorescent lights turned everything clinical. Paper had the cold texture of truth when facts are laid bare. The officers unrolled photographs like evidence tapestries, a receipt from a pawnshop with Serena's handwriting so small and tidy, an email chain where she had inched her way toward a plan to discredit me, photos from Robert's tailing that mapped her routes like a spiderweb, each piece slotting into the next with the inevitable logic of a machine designed to reveal. Serena's composure evaporated under the files. She tried to plead ignorance, then lied, then, faced with the receipts and recorded messages and Robert's time and date tapes, began to disclose a darker network, a system that used easy smiles to mask older crimes. Her sentences were jagged. At one point, she pulled at a sleeve and said, "We needed the money." The words, soft as dust and twice as damning. She named names like she was shedding scabs. It was as if, in her panic, she had chosen to trade herself for lesser players in a much bigger game. Oliver stood in the corner of the interview room, and I watched him like someone watching a portrait rearrange itself. His face was a geography of regret. When he finally spoke to me, the words were halting but honest, like stones shifted into a new path. "Mom," he started, and his voice broke in a way that made me see the child he had been and the man he could still become. "I'm so sorry. You should have listened," I said. And the sentence was not revenge. It was something cleaner, a mirror held up. He folded into his own shame, which is an important thing to witness. Shame has the odd ability to be the seed for change if one tends it. The legal wheels turned with a grace that was merciless. Serena cooperated insofar as bargaining with a shorter sentence for a fuller exposure. She named people, the net widened. Authorities moved on other addresses, small-time fences were arrested. It turned out she had been part of a tidy machine that fed on trust and family gatherings and gentle old women who couldn't imagine the world had teeth. Watching the coagulation of truth felt like stepping into light after years in a cellar. Sitting alone later with the police reports spread across a table, I tasted a complex blend of victory and emptiness. For years I'd wanted vindication. Vindication is not a warm bath, it is a clearing, it is necessary. It is also small compared to the decades of eroded mornings and smudged dignity. I felt furious, yes, I felt relieved, certainly, but it was not the exhilaration some might imagine. Revenge, properly executed, is a cold surgeon, precise, inevitable, and then finished. Oliver came to my house that night. We walked through the rooms that Arthur and I had arranged together, the drawing room with its faded wallpaper, the kitchen where the lemon scent caught on the hinges, the bedroom where I still kept the handkerchief with Arthur's initials. We talked like people who had been sutured back together clumsily. He asked questions and listened without defending Serena. He asked about the inventory, about the safe, about how long I had suspected. He listened when I told him that love is sometimes the blindest of all the colors. He promised to make amends, not by deflecting blame, but by rebuilding trust, small piece by small piece. It was not a promise to erase the past. It was a blueprint for moving forward. He would start by doing the right things, not by grand gestures, but by showing up. He would be present when I needed him, not just when appearances demanded it. I locked the safe that night and ran my thumb on the cold metal. The house had its noises, the settling of old beams, the wind taking a last breath through the eaves. The pink diamond lay where it had always been, a tiny sun in velvet, proof that when one keeps careful accounts, truth is more loyal than charm. I had not expected the relief to be so mundane. A click, a locking. The world returned to its ordinary clatter, but the axis had shifted. Where, once I had been invisible, I was now accounted for in the ledger of consequence. Outside, somewhere beyond my garden, lights winked from neighboring houses. Inside, I poured a cup of tea and sat at the table where Arthur and I had first spoken of a life together. The quiet wrapped around me like a shawl. I was tired in a bone-deep way and oddly lucid. The sting of what had been taken receded into a line on my skin, a scar that would not vanish but would be a reminder that dignity, once reclaimed, is a stronger currency than any jewel. When morning came, it found me at my window with the handkerchief pressed to my face. I thought of the gala and the way people had turned when they heard the truth. I thought of Serena and the choices that had pushed her into the arms of consequences. I thought of Oliver and the slow work ahead to become the son I needed. Most of all, I thought of Arthur and how he had always said the truest revenge is to live well. I smiled, small, private, irreversibles, and went to make a list of the things I would do next. They thought the worst had been done the night the police led Serena out in cuffs. They didn't know the worst was just the beginning. The trial was a slow, deliberate thing. A careful unspooling of lies and receipts, of pawnshop tags and appraisals, of photographs with dates stamped on them like little nails hammered into a false story. I sat beneath the courtroom lights that hummed above like a small, indifferent sun, and I listened. The air smelled of paper and old leather, of the kind of coffee you drink because you must, not because it comforts. Every shuffle of a file, every soft cough seemed suddenly amplified. The judge's gavel landed like a metronome marking the movement toward truth. When witnesses took the stand, their faces were ordinary. The harm they described was not. One by one, people who'd been targeted by Serena's circle came forward. Quiet admissions, faces turned down, hands twisting in nervous grief. A woman from 3 suburbs over spoke about the same pattern: charm, access, a theft that began with small things and grew more brazen. The clerk read receipts that matched the photo timestamps Robert had sent me in those long, sleepless nights. Each paper was a tiny detonator, and the whole of Serena's facade rocked under the blast. Serena's own testimony was a study in fracture. She began with denial, with the brittle, rehearsed politeness of someone used to controlling a room. Then the cracks showed. Under cross-examination, a string of contradictions came loose. Her voice sometimes rolled into a petulant laugh. Other times it thinned to a whisper. The defense tried to weave confusion, to paint me as forgetful, sentimental, easily offended. Walter was steady. He asked the questions that mattered. He reminded the court of dates and careful inventories. When confronted with pawnshop records and the emails that planned for my supposed incompetence, Serena's posture crumpled. She'd been playing a long game. The very playbook she used to manipulate others became the instrument of her undoing. There were moments of theater I never expected. One afternoon, the prosecutor said she had a caller on the line, someone who'd been encouraged, maybe coerced, into helping Serena ship items. The call was played. The voice on the speaker, shaky and small, admitted their part. It wasn't just a single theft, it was an operation. That admission widened the case like a lens zooming out. Serena was not an isolated menace, but a node in a larger network. Hearing it made my jaw ache with relief and anger braided together. Justice was no longer a private satisfaction. It was a public unmasking. Outside the courtroom, Oliver moved through the aftermath as if in a fog. Splits in his face I hadn't seen before became familiar. The hollowed cheeks, the way his hands fumbled with his phone. He listened to voices and then would stare at the floor, grip loosening, then tightening. When he finally spoke to me in private, his apology came out like an exhale after holding his breath for years. It was not tidy. It was messy and painful in the way only truth can be. There were tears, there were clumsy attempts at explanations. He had been asleep at the wheel, distracted by work and the easy grace of Serena's charm. He admitted he'd seen things and chose to look away, which cut deeper than any theft. He left Serena not with vindictive theatrics, but with a legal, quiet severing. There was a divorce filed, papers signed in a tidy lawyer's office away from cameras. The divorce felt like a small, necessary pruning. At first, our conversations were awkward. They moved between practicalities and an earnest, halting attempt at reconnection. We began to peel back the years of habit and avoidance. There were silences that felt hopeful, and others that felt like old scabs reopening. Choosing a new engagement ring for Natalie months later felt less like making amends and more like making a new promise out loud. We went together to a small jeweler whose window caught the afternoon sun and set the gems alight. Natalie's face when Oliver slipped a modest, thoughtful ring onto her finger was warm and genuine. It was, in its quiet way, a rebuke to the spectacle of Serena's greed, love that was respectful, not transactional. My world shifted in ways that extended beyond courtrooms and family disputes. The story had escaped our living room and found an audience hungry for the same kind of quiet justice. People wrote to me. Letters, emails, comments, all that small, noisy proof that my experience was not unique. I took those messages into my chest like medicine. They gave me a new purpose. With Walter and a few trusted advisors, I founded a small charity first, a hotline, a modest fund to help elders with legal advice and emergency aid. We named it simply and with intent, Eleanor's Foundation. The first office was cramped, walls a pale blue that made the paperwork seem less heavy. Volunteers arrived with cups of tea, with notebooks, with a fierce, hopeful energy I hadn't expected. The foundation grew in steps rather than leaps. There were grants to write, meetings to attend, fundraising dinners that felt oddly familiar in the way they brought strangers into rooms that could be dangerous or life-saving, depending on who held the utensils. I learned grant language with a stubborn curiosity. I learned how to listen to callers who described being made to feel small and invisible. Each call was a reminder that my victory was not solely for me. It mattered in real lives, in the quiet desperation of people who'd been told they were past their usefulness. The TV show came later, almost accidentally. A producer reached out, not with the trite sensationalism I'd feared, but with a sober pitch. Help elders tell their stories. Teach them the legal basics. Lend them a voice in a world that often listens only to the loudest. We named the show Eleanor's Wisdom, which felt too grand at first until I realized it was fitting. The first time I sat under studio lights, the bulbs were hot like a small summer. The cameras were sleek, black eyes that watched me with steady curiosity. The makeup artist was gentle and practical. The set was warm, an armchair, a bookshelf with a few of Arthur's old books, a cup of tea cooling on a saucer. It felt right because it was honest. The first broadcast was nerve-wracking in a way trials never were. In court, you prepare and wait. On live television, you respond. The director counted us in, and the red light blinked like the beginning of something irrevocable. My voice found its shape easily. Years of practice in quiet rooms had made me conversational. Callers began to ring through almost immediately. The first grateful voice was soft and tremulous. A woman who had been convinced by her children to sign away her financial control, who'd felt foolish and ashamed and too embarrassed to speak. When she asked how to begin to take the first step back, she spoke with a mixture of fear and tentative hope. I remember the way my heart warmed then, the exact sense of my chest unclenching. That caller's thanks felt like the first public seal of what I'd hoped the foundation could be. Practical, human, steady. I found a rhythm and advocacy I hadn't known I was ready for. Every speech, every appearance, every caller who said, "You saved me from feeling like the problem," was a small restoration. Where I had once cataloged trinkets and numbers and inventories, I now cataloged the names of people who needed help and the resources that could reach them. It made me meticulous in the same way as before, but the stakes were changed. They were broader, kinder. There were nights I still woke with the image of Serena at that gala, the way she'd moved like a shadow across the room. Memory returns sometimes, with edges sharper than the events themselves, but those nights came less often. Mostly, the days settled into a pattern of work and purpose and the occasional unhurried joy of finding peace. People began to recognize me when I walked the sidewalks. Some reached out to touch my arm in thanks. At lectures, I would speak about patience as a tactic, about how strategy can be as powerful as anger if it's disciplined and proportionate. I'd tell them that revenge in its rawest form is hollow, but justice, crafted, evidenced, shared, can heal more than one person. Reflecting now, the arc from small humiliations to public vindication is not a neat line. It's a ragged path with stones of regret and patches of sunlight. The law did its part. Sympathy and empathy did others. The most lasting change was internal, a redistribution of identity. I was not merely the woman who kept a house or the widow who polished the silver. I became someone who could both be gentle and be firm, someone who could protect the tender things she loved without losing herself in bitterness. That balance, the fierce calm, is the inheritance I claim now. I am visible. I am not loud for the sake of being seen, but I stand where I can be useful. I am fierce when I must be, but most often, I am simply steady. The quiet work of rebuilding a life, a family, and a community has given me a different kind of wealth. Arthur's objects were a legacy in their own right, but the greater inheritance is this, a life remade into a place of advocacy, comfort, and certain well-earned dignity. If this revenge saga gave you that rush of justice, smash like, subscribe for more epic tales, and share your own revenge in the comments. Click the next video box for another one.